Awesome. Well, I guess we'll get into it. So, just to get started, you're clearly a very highly renowned figure in academia and industry, just evidenced by your comments as well, saying that everyone wants a piece of you, with a very, very impressive, mind-boggling output of papers and books. I think your ANU profile states 1,400 published articles and 48 books, something along those lines, which is almost incomprehensible over here on this end. But so maybe to kick things off, would you be able to speak to how you got here to the point where you are? What led you along this path, or what was your path to begin with, and maybe why that path was taken?
Gosh, what led me to this path? So when I was a kid, my parents used to take these epic car drives, and we would go from Canberra to Adelaide or Melbourne to Hervey Bay in Queensland. And in those days, there was no radio, there was no DVDs, there were no CDs, and all I got to do was look at landscapes out the window.
Right.
And so that really resonated with me as time went on. And actually, I was more interested in kicking footballs as a kid than I was about the environment. And I played a lot of football, played a lot of soccer. And so I didn't really connect deeply with the notion of environment until in my early teens. My father, who was a very eccentric man and had lots and lots of hobbies, really got interested in bird watching. And so he used to drag me out on these trips, bird watching trips, with these extraordinary people that seemed to only need to hear a bird fart from 400 metres and they knew what it was.
Yeah.
And I became more and more intrigued as time went on. And then by the time I was 19, and I'd actually had a bit of a stint playing football in Europe, I realised I wasn't big enough. My hands were the same size as Donald Trump's, so it was never going to be a big goalkeeper. And I got really interested in environmental things, and I originally started my life as a marine biologist, working with a very famous coral reef biologist, a guy called Charlie Veron, who's now the godfather of coral reef biology. And as time went on, I became more and more interested, actually not in marine biology, but in forest ecology. And I was fortunate enough to land a job as a technical assistant in 1983. And so 40 years later, here we are, still doing forest ecology and management. And somehow life just doesn't seem to be long enough. I just feel like I have another 40 or 50 years of work to do, but I'm not sure I'm going to last quite that long.
Still a technical assistant at heart.
Yes,
a little bit more than that now.
I love being in the field. I love being in the forest. There's nothing I like more than doing bird plots, counting birds. But I have my little yellow notebooks everywhere I go. I've even got one here right now. My little waterproof notebooks that I take in the forest with me. Yeah. And it's where I get a source of inspiration about how the forest works, why it works the way it does, all kinds of things. And it's still a fascinating thing, remarkable environments and if I could still be counting birds. Many of my close mentors are now in their late 80s, and they're still these guys are still doing field work. And I would love to be able to still be like that in 20 years' time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe later on I was wanting to touch on the idea of things like drive and how important that is to, well, things like health and keeping you going. And so it's impressive that you're, and probably lucky that you still have a passion even what did you say, 40 years on into your career. I'm not sure if that's something that people are able to maintain or even have that initial engagement to begin with. So that's wonderful. And so you think that this started around the age of 19, 20, but it has its seeds or its roots in childhood.
Yeah, I think so. My parents, as I said, used to do these amazing long driving trips, and my mother was into history. My father was into natural environments, and so we used to have these very conflicted holidays. But to me, it was always fascinating to see these different places and maybe the connection between history and environment, and just kind of understanding these places. And so I was very fortunate to be able to see lots of different parts of Australia as time went on, and realise what an incredible country this really is. And I think often it saddens me that Australians don't really appreciate how extraordinary it is, and this concept of the natural heritage that we have here that's actually very important to protect.
Yeah. Well, I imagine most people don't actually get out into the country all that much in Australia. I'm from the Northern Territory, from Darwin, and so going out into the bush, into the outback and camping and things like that, it's very natural, but I've spent and that's what people do up there, but spend a lot of time in cities through university or what have you, and it's where the majority of our population is, and they don't venture outside the boundaries of those cities very often. And you're right, it is a beautiful landscape. I've driven across 10,000 k's or so of driving across Australia more, and you get such a diverse, beautiful range. And so maybe the lesson there then from your childhood is that if we want more prominent ecologists, conservationists in Australia, then we need to force them to stare out the windows as kids and to put away the phones and and everything.
Yeah, I think one of the great Australian myths, sadly, is this notion of the great Australian bushman or bush person.
Right.
Yet nearly 90% of Australians actually live in cities and are completely disconnected from their natural environment. And where I've worked for 40 years in the Central Highlands of Victoria, it's 90 minutes from the MCG. Mm-hmm. And almost everybody in Melbourne knows who plays full forward for Essendon or Carlton or Collingwood, who plays half back for Geelong or Footscray or whatever. They have no idea that nearly all of their water comes from these magnificent forests, the tallest flowering plants on the planet, that are literally an hour and a half's drive from the MCG. They've got no idea. So this is Australia's largest city now, so close to these incredible environments that almost none of the Melburnian population actually has any idea that's even there.
It's a good point, isn't it? When you think about it, that Australia as a developed, a landmass that hosts a developed nation and civilization, has a relatively large amount of remaining bush habitat, vegetation, whatever you want to call it, compared to say places like Europe and North America, what have you. That is also, and there are other places, say South America and Asia and what have you, that have plenty of nature and remnant jungle, but they're perhaps not as hospitable as Australia is in terms of the outback. Australia is quite a hospitable place, I would say. It's very easy to get to places, and there's not that many things that you have to worry about along the way. If that makes sense. So I guess in that sense, it is really a perfect land mass to explore and appreciate, but is, like you're saying, is relatively undervalued in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's quite mythical in Australia that everybody likes to go bush, but in fact, very few people do, and they're more likely to watch something on television about the Great Australian Bush than actually go there themselves. And I think that's rather tragic, because one of the ways that you build a constituency for conservation is to have more people being able to engage with the environment. And when they do that, it's good for their mental health, it's good for their physical health, and you build a constituency for people that want to support good conservation. because
Yeah.
the chances are, if we do it well in Australia, it becomes the envy of the world, as one of the most
Mhm.
remarkable places in the world in terms of its biology, the different species, the different environments. Going from coral reefs to rainforests to deserts to tropical savannas to native grasslands. Yeah, so
Yeah, well, maybe on that note then, now that we're here, I was thinking of talking about it later, but the topic of science communication, well, you've kind of been alluding to science communication and perhaps the lack of that, maybe in terms of our forests or the valuing to the value proposition to the public of things like forests, habitat, ecosystems, and things along those lines. What kind of a job do you think we do in Australia in terms of science communication and promoting the value of our habitats and our ecosystems? And do you have any perhaps comments on what isn't being done versus what is being done, and what we should do more of, or what we frankly need to do more of in this space?
Yeah, it's a bit of a vexed issue, this one, because the conventional, traditional notion of a scientist is a very dispassionate, straight down the line, no emotion kind of person that's just giving you the bald facts about this, that, or the other, and it's incredibly boring. And that's what we're supposed to do. And that I get that. We're just supposed to deliver the message about how many species are declining, how many species are increasing, and is it good or is it bad? But the reality is that the public pays for most of the research that we do, and we need to, I think we need to satisfy the public that what we're doing is meaningful, and present that information in a way that the people resonate with, but also to gather support for how we can do things better. What I've seen across my career is a massive decline, for example, in government investment in the environment.
Really?
To the extent where roughly 4 cents in every $100 in the federal government's spend is now spent on the environment. 4 cents in every $100.
Yeah.
And so government priorities are reflected in their spending by government. And so we're more than capable of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on submarines, but hardly anything on the environment. It's ridiculous. And so how do we change the psyche of our politics? Well, people do that. People demand something different. And so people have got to demand something different from governments. Governments don't lead us. Governments follow. And governments follow where public opinion is. And we have to push public opinion harder to change the psyche around why it's really important to protect the nation's environments.
And do you think that burden falls on the scientists themselves, on academia or industry?
I think it largely, the burden falls on scientists to better communicate what they're doing and why we need to change things, and to be more creative and more forceful, more creative, more forceful about the kinds of changes that are needed. I know it's been very difficult. It's very difficult for scientists to be able to counter the rubbish that comes out on Sky News about Sky News studios must be the only places in Australia where there's no evidence of climate change.
Yeah.
The reality is that the science shows that overwhelmingly that there are major changes, and scientists need to be able to prosecute their case in stronger ways, more convincing ways, more engaging ways, but also not only highlight the problems, but I think more importantly, highlight the solutions to those problems and take us to a better place.
And so, well, I guess a question there is communication enough? Is better communication enough? When you're talking about an economy, in some sense, everything has to, whether whether it should or shouldn't, in some sense, rests inside the boundaries of an economy. Australia, when you talk about Australia's politics, Australia's ecosystems, it's all Australia's land, it's all part of the economy of Australia. And so whether or not just simple communication to the public and then incurring public support is enough, but so the question of leveraging economics to support nature and to support conservation, that's a big one, certainly, and I think that's where the general landscape is going. At least, say, in climate change, for example, we've had carbon markets for a while now, but carbon markets and offset markets in Australia, but also in the voluntary international markets, are gaining increasing importance and significance as a way of combating climate change and as a solution to climate change. Now, regardless of whether your opinion on the matter in terms of whether that's effective or justified in principle, that's at least evidence of an economic mechanism that's trying to tackle the issue. Now, alongside that, what's coming in now are these biodiversity markets and these nature markets. Australia tried to have its nature bill passed earlier this year, which failed, and then failed again earlier. Well, I should say within a few months, perhaps earlier this month, I think, or last month. What is your opinion, if any, on the ability of biodiversity markets and something like a biodiversity scheme to help tackle this problem? And if what are the perverse incentives there, if any?
Yeah, the notion of nature repair markets, I think, is certainly an interesting one. And I know that some of the deep philosophical problems associated with groups like the Greens that think that this is commodifying nature and this is the end of the world as we know it. Mm-hmm. But I think at the same time, we know that, for example, the restoration challenge globally is more than $14 trillion, which is a third of the US's entire GDP. Mm-hmm. So the reality is that the scale of the challenge is so large that we have to be able to rethink the ways that business can engage in this space to bring their enormous financial resources to help with restoration, biodiversity recovery, all those kinds of things. So I think what we really need to do is we need to create these kinds of markets with the right kinds of monitoring, the right kinds of guardrails, so that the system isn't gamed. All the work so far shows that almost all of the restoration initiatives of some of the world's biggest companies are actually greenwashed. They're not real. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we also know through the World Economic Forum that about 50% of the world's economy, 50% of the world's economy is at risk of biodiversity loss. Mm-hmm. So we're actually talking about potential collapse of humanity here if we don't seriously engage with the environment and we don't seriously invest in this space to tackle the problem. So, in many cases now, we've started to talk to investment banks, superannuation schemes, pension funds and the like, and I've had many discussions with them, recognising that irrespective of what government does, they need to do something to cement their sustainability development goals in place. And so part of their often $1 trillion portfolios are looking for green investments that are verifiable, credible, have strong and robust monitoring behind them to be able to show that they're really making a difference. Like in the past, when I used to fly with an airline, I didn't like to fly much, but occasionally I had to fly. The airline told us that our flights were the carbon emissions for our flights were being offset. They were planting mango trees in India, for example. Well, it then turns out that nobody could find the bloody mango trees. They weren't even sure they existed. And essentially it was bullshit on steroids. So what we have to do now is to make sure that with the potential money that's going to wash through the system to do things better, it has to be credible. It has to be verifiable, which means that it has to be monitored and monitored well. And our estimate is that for any given program, it's going to cost about 10% to do that, 10% of your total budget. So if you've got a $200 million green fund, fine. $20 million of that is going to have to be spent on monitoring to make sure that what you're doing is real. If it's a $500 million green bond, then it's going to be $50 million. And that's just the price of making sure that it's real and it's not gamed. And it has to be done independently. So the monitoring can't be done by anybody that's going to be a benefactor, a beneficiary of this. It has to be done totally independently.
Exactly. No, I think you're completely correct. The business that I work for, company that I work for, is in this space, and we submitted a submission to the Innovative Biodiversity Monitoring Grant that was released by the government mid-year, which by the Department of Climate Change, which you may have been aware of, but has then since just faded off into the background amongst a plethora of other problems that have surfaced. But one issue that I see here, which you may not have an opinion on, is one problem that I foresee is that currently nature-based solutions, so carbon projects in the form of avoided emissions projects, REDD+, etc., are currently under an enormous amount of fire in the media, from academic institutions and from journalistic institutions. Rightly so in some cases, and perhaps less so in others. But what they're serving to do is cripple the carbon offset market, severely cripple the carbon offset market, and reduce its, if not its ultimate potential, then the speed at which it will reach its potential. And the problem that I see here is that a biodiversity market can only operate effectively piggybacking in absence of a compliance something complying people to offset biodiversity, which isn't present in Australia or globally, must piggyback on something like carbon markets and carbon projects and carbon offsets as things like co-benefits and additional integrity and premiums and incentives. So wondered if you had an opinion at all on this idea of, okay, well, maybe some carbon projects aren't perfect and they need criticism, but it's to be criticized and inspected, investigated, but it's a fine line to be walked from throwing the baby out with the bathwater entirely and denigrating them because they're not completely perfect. Do you think it's worth making an allowance there for things that aren't completely perfect, so long as they still ultimately support something like a thriving biodiversity market in that sense? Any opinions along those lines?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to design something that's completely perfect. And I think sometimes there's a lot to be gained from looking at what's worked and what's not worked elsewhere. A good example is the biomass burning industry. There are countries like Finland and Sweden that are now looking at themselves thinking, oh my God, what have we done? The reality is that biomass burning generates a ton of carbon emissions for every ton of biomass that's burnt. This is nuts. But they've gone down this pathway, and Australia can avoid those kinds of highly perverse outcomes by looking at what's worked and what's not worked elsewhere. And I think it's important to be aware that it's important. I think it's important to be aware that there are times when the perfect is the enemy of the good, as they say. That old cliche. We're not going to get everything right. We are going to make mistakes, and the hope is that we make fewer mistakes and have more good outcomes than we might otherwise have had.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a promising perspective from someone like you. You alluded to the Greens earlier and some of maybe the ideological positions that they have, and I think the at least the loudest part of the environmental sort of movement globally is captured by this idea of perfection. And if something's not perfect, it's the enemy, it's the death, the apocalypse in that sense. And not only is it that, it's very much an it seems like a very anti-capitalistic movement. And you must punish your big emitters. You can't let them. You can't let them offset. That's like letting them go free in some sense, even though it's sort of not really. So it's this tricky point where you've got this conflict in the from people say like yourselves, and I imagine most of academia, but then you're more publicly, and this comes back to the science communication part, perhaps the more vocal public environmentalist side of things that advocate for a kind of zealous position on these matters that isn't going to be necessarily helpful. Like, and I think this has come into play with the biodiversity market, the nature proposal in Australia as well. Like, I know that there's been a lot of integrity concerns around biodiversity offset schemes up to this point. Maybe would you be able to touch on that? What do you think is the likelihood of being able to implement a successful biodiversity offset scheme in light of past evidence of effort up to this point?
I think biodiversity offsets are a real problem, just like carbon offsets. But to me, the reality is that the scale of the restoration challenge is that in many cases we don't necessarily have to even enter into the offset space to make a difference. And
Right.
we know, for example, in Victoria, where I've worked for a long time, that nearly 40% of all wood production landscapes haven't regenerated properly. So there's 40% of the forest landmass that actually needs to have trees put back into it. There's a lot of carbon that will be tied up in those trees, as well as biodiversity dividends. We don't even need to think deeply about whether or not this is an appropriate offset for the Scarborough project in West Australia or the Beetaloo Basin project in the Northern Territory. We just actually need to get ahead and get those forests back into the ground and regrowing.
Yeah.
And so there are big pension funds that are looking at these kinds of opportunities, not because they're an offset, but because we simply need to fix the carbon and fix the forest as part of restoration. The reality is that people will always gain these things. But the other reality is that when you look at the carbon profiles of what's happening in the landscape and happening globally, if you look at something like the Keeling curve is measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. The levels of carbon in the atmosphere are phenomenal. CO2 in the atmosphere that when I was doing my undergraduate 40 years ago, they were about 330 parts per million. Now it's 420 parts per million. And when we get to 500 parts per million, which we're well on the way to, we're starting to talk about 3 to 4 degrees extra temperature. We start to talk about 10 metres of extra sea level rise. The consequences for humanity of those kinds of things are just astronomical. So yeah, we can mess around, we can game things, and play games with how things are set up. But the environment's going to come back and bite us on the ass severely if we don't actually engage properly with this. It's going to get away. It's going to get away from us. And as the World Economic Forum says, as part of the biodiversity loss, that potentially threatens 50% of the world's economy.
You have to do something, right? It's not sufficient to either do nothing because of a lack of care, but also not sufficient to do nothing because you're worried that it's not perfect.
Exactly.
You can't operate on those ideological ends of the spectrum.
So I look at the sad history of the Greens and the Rudd government with the carbon pollution reduction scheme, and the potential back then in 2008, 2009, to have had a carbon pollution reduction scheme. And all the bullshit that went down with that, it wasn't perfect, it was going to reward some of the big polluters, all those kinds of things. Yeah. And, here we are, 15 years later, still dicking around in this space. I just think that sometimes things are not perfect,
Yeah.
but you've got to implement them, and then you've got to work to improve them sequentially over the time to keep taking you to a better place and strengthening things. Otherwise, If we wait for the perfect outcome, it's just never going to happen.
You've got to make allowances for error.
If we're all waiting for the perfect wife or the perfect husband or the perfect partner, they don't exist. You've got to deal with the things that aren't perfect. Otherwise,
you will have been perfectly alone.
Perfectly alone for the rest of your time, and
for your whole life. Okay,
some people might dig that, but I think the most of us don't want that, and we've got to work with the best that we have, and then try to make it better over time.
Yeah, 100%. I know that forestry and sustainable forestry is a big part of your work, and so I wanted to touch on that, and this plays into this idea. I imagine. What's the go with forestry in terms of, is forestry always a net negative for the climate, for conservation, or is it just that it's always done badly? Is there really such a thing as sustainable forestry? And is forestry something that will ever, realistically, again, going back to that point about being in an economy, something that will cease?
I think forestry is important. The problem generally has been that forestry has not been ecologically sustainable. The forest landscapes have been and sustainable yields have been hopelessly overcommitted, and now there are other issues that are starting to play into this space. So we know, for example, that logged forests are far more flammable than intact forests, and the rate at which forests are burning means that it's actually not possible to grow crops of saw logs before the forest burns again. And so I think there would have possibly been, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, an opportunity to rejig the native forest logging industry so that it might have had some semblance of sustainability. But I think the whole process has gone too far, too quickly, too extensively, and in a changing climate, we're in a really serious space. So I think now really the forest industry in Australia needs to be focused around plantations. If you actually look at the structure of the native forest logging industry now, it's 90% wood chips and paper pulp. It's not timber. It's not making houses. It's not making floorboards. It's not making roof trusses. It's not making fine furniture. It's wood chips and paper pulp. And that generates a lot of emissions. Carbon doesn't get stored in the system for very long before it goes to landfill. And therein lies some major problems that don't take us to where we need to get to.
Right. And so plantation forestry would obviously come with some of its own negatives, but it's still a net positive over the clearing and logging of native forest.
It certainly is. So the issue with native forest logging is that it generates a large amount of emissions. It makes forests more prone to more high severity fire, and it's an effect that lasts for up to 70 years after logging. So the forest logging has played significantly into the space of increased fire severity. That's a major problem. Right.
Did it contribute significantly to the 2019-2020 bushfires on the East Coast?
Yes, it did. So we know that forests that were logged in the last 70 years, burnt at log forest always burnt at higher severity than intact forests. Logged forests burning under moderate fire weather conditions still burnt at greater severity than intact forests burning under extreme conditions. Now, we saw the same effect after the 2009 fires. And so the bottom line is that logging is contributing significantly to long-term elevated fire severity right across the fire footprint.
Mm-hmm.
For example, what we saw in Black Summer. Okay,
Yeah,
so
right.
that contributes not only to flammability and the safety issues for local communities, but it also contributes to carbon emissions through fire. So,
Mm-hmm.
so then the issue is, where do we get our timber? And the answer is, we get our timber from plantations. And
Right.
we know that there are less emissions because there's less wood waste associated with plantations. And at the same time, there is significant, you're significantly more likely to be able to get a crop of trees off a plantation more quickly, which is good, because with high frequency fires, you're much more likely to see a crop produced in the time. We know that the probability of a forest growing through for 80 years before it gets burnt is less than 20%.
Right.
So there's an 80% chance that a forest that's planted now, there's an 80% chance it's going to get burnt in the next 80 years.
Yeah.
Now, that means that forest doesn't produce a sawlog, whereas a plantation starts producing wood products within 15 years and provides timber within 25 years.
Where do you think that land is going to have to come from?
Well, we already have significant plantation areas, across most states, except the Northern Territory. We know that the plantation sector already produces 90% of all the sawn timber in Australia.
Right.
We know that 93% of all plantation hardwood timber, pulpwood, is actually being exported, which is insane. Right. So we need to actually start processing that material in Australia for Australian jobs. The structure of our industry is completely distorted, and that needs to change.
And you played an instrumental role, as I understand it, in the cessation of logging in Victoria and with Vic forests. Is that a scenario there that you've just been describing, where that's now going to plantation forestry? And do you see that trend of cessation of logging of natural native forests continuing into other states like New South Wales and Queensland? I
think we have to stop native forest logging right across Australia. So the carbon dividend that we've seen indicates that that if we were to stop native forest logging tomorrow, we would reduce our carbon emissions by 43%.
Right.
We would reach...
It's a very significant
number. We would reach our 2030 targets. So what that means is that we would reach our 2030 targets plus have an 11% fossil fuel offset dividend by stopping native forest logging. Now, the number of jobs associated with the industry is incredibly small. So in Tasmania, it's about 630. In Victoria, it's about 530. Southern New South Wales, it was about 280. I don't know what it was in Northern New South Wales, but we're actually talking about not many jobs. But you still need a workforce. If you're going to manage native forests for carbon, you still need a workforce to protect it from fire, to boost regeneration, to tackle issues with feral animals, all those kinds of things.
This is one of the things that I find a little boggling. I work quite intimately in the carbon industry, is that they don't have a mechanism for incentivizing conservation of forests, like avoided deforestation emissions, like you see elsewhere, of the kind that you're speaking. It's about. It's a little strange that, because there's all these barriers of proving that you're going to be logged and additionality and all these things that are, purportedly stopping that. But like you just said yourself, if that was, there's clearly a data trend that would have led to the claim that you just made of, 40% reduction in emissions, that would justify the creation of carbon projects in these areas. Is that something that you a space that you work in at all, or been a part of, or been approached by, or like for the development of carbon methodologies in native forests around avoided clearing or avoided deforestation?
Yeah, I've seen quite a bit of work in this space. There is a need. There is a need to think about the methodology to be able to promote carbon storage. And while people keep dicking around with this, and we keep thinking that we can log forests and it's good for the environment, we're just going to keep creating massive amounts of emissions. That's going to take us to a terrible place. The reality is it's better to have intact forests than log forests. It's better to have wood products from plantations and not from native forests. It just goes on. And so while we mess around with this, essentially we're basically fiddling while Rome burns, while the planet burns, literally, as we speak.
Yeah. And so how would you judge our biodiversity, Australia, as it stands at this moment, and where it was maybe 20 years ago and where you think in current trajectories it is to be in 20 years, our state of our ecology?
I think if you look at what's really happening here, Australia is leading the world in mammal extinctions. We've had 3 mammal extinctions and 3 reptile extinctions. We've had 3 vertebrate extinctions in the last 10 years. The rate of extinctions is not declining. Our spend on threatened species is pitiful. It's about 1/10 of what it needs to be. You can buy a screen door and a submarine for it costs you more to do that. It's so our spending priorities are really, really crazy in this space, and I just think that there needs to be some rethinking about our budget spend in this space, because our record on biodiversity conservation is woeful. We have a federal minister that has pledged to have no more extinctions in this space, but the spending relative to what's needed is just mismatched.
Right.
So whether they're real commitments or whether they're idle words, we'll see. I suspect it's the latter, not the former.
Well, how do we get there in terms of making the government fulfill their obligations, or at least their sentiments that they've put out there? It seems that the Greens aren't going to be able to do that, or they're not fulfilling their task in that sense. Like, where does that impetus come from? Is it again just from lobbying from the public through via scientific or from scientists via the public, from scientists directly? In your opinion, what's the most effective way to try to implement some of these changes that you would like to see?
I think scientists have to work even harder to be more creative in their communication. I think there has to be much stronger advocacy in this space. I think scientists need to move away from being so conservative and actually call it out for what's really happening. I think they need to engage in the political process more strongly, indicate what's going on. I'm a strong believer in rethinking how you can engage with government and engage with the financial sector to indicate the seriousness of the problem. And there are organisations that are beginning to do this in a big way. Patagonia, for example, the clothing company, has recognised that the future of the planet's really at stake here. They no longer want to make major profits, which then go to shareholders and the executive. They're going to invest everything that they make from their clothing into the environment and changing the environment. And, we need more big corporates to take this seriously, because if biodiversity loss threatens half the world's economy, as the World Economic Forum is saying, then we have really got to get our act together to do something about it. Otherwise it is going to undermine not only the world's economy, but humanity that's associated with it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been my opinion for the past few years that the level of change and action required for things like climate and biodiversity is not really going to come from things like government, and at the government level, it has to come from the marketplace. It has to come from industry. That's where all the energy is. That's where the impetus is, I think, and the incentives and the pressure and the mechanisms that are actually available to make these things work. Like the government is they can provide a regulatory framework, compliance framework that incentivizes some of these things, but seems to me like it's like you just said, entities like Patagonia, etc., that are the ones that need to drive these change, this kind of change. But unfortunately, as we've seen with companies like Nestle, etc., that have been pushed by recent attacks on offsets away from carbon offsetting, and thus away from nature-based solutions, and then from nature repair in that sense. So, while it's a conflicted space, in that I think it needs to come from private enterprise, but private enterprise is currently under attack in terms of perspective and perception, and that's actually coming from the realm of academia as well. So it's where the resolution is there, I'm not sure, but
I think there's no doubt that the private sector and business has a big role to play here, and they need to invest their significant capital in this space. But government actually has to seriously regulate it and maintain the regulation and ensure that they hold the line when business wants deregulation. Because deregulation in this space will lead to disaster and it being gamed. And it simply has to regulate it properly, it has to monitor it properly, and not have it watered down. Otherwise, it'll just be a bullshit market like has happened previously. You know, the carbon market's been gamed. There's all sorts of rubbish that goes on in the carbon market that shouldn't be, because it hasn't been properly managed, hasn't been properly monitored. You know, there are millions and millions of carbon credits out there rewarding projects that are hardly storing any carbon at all.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think these are all very wise words, and conscious of the time that we have left, there were some other questions that I wanted to touch on, bringing it back maybe to a more personal level again, like we were at the start. So as I mentioned, you've been a paragon of productivity for so long, and it's very clear that there's a lot of meaning for you in the pursuit of things like conservation and nature and ecology, and there's a lot of value there, and so that's allowed you to have this drive to perform this kind of work and then continue to do so. I wondered if you could just speak on how you maybe conceptualize the idea of meaning, of what's meaningful to you again, and how you balance competing meaning or values in your life. Like you're doing now, you're engaging with me now at 8 p.m. at night, rather than off with your family or what have you. And I imagine that's not something that's too irregular for you. So how do you balance things? How do you value things in that sense?
Yeah, that is a challenge. And my daughter's just here from Brisbane now, and the other night we were planning to do our interviews, and I had to make a dash to hospital.
Yeah.
I suppose it just means that I don't sleep much.
Okay.
And I suppose I'm motivated by wanting to make a difference, and not just to my grandkids, but your grandkids and other people's grandkids and family and whatever. Because I think the reality is that the world is still a beautiful place, despite all the wars and the famines and the droughts and the floods and the disease that we've had. It's still a beautiful place, and there are more good people in the world than there are bad people. But we need to recognise that the environment is critical to how the world functions. As Tony Abbott said, we can't have the environment if we don't have the economy. He basically got it completely arse about. You can't have an economy unless you have the environment. And so we need to tackle this issue of how we conserve the environment, not only in terms of its importance for humanity and its importance for people's mental health and physical health, but it's actually important for our economic health as well. So
Right.
as someone who's been privileged enough to be able to work basically in a context of free speech for the last 40 years, I think it's important for me to be able to speak out about what I think are the important things and what's right in this space, because not everybody can do that. Young scientists can't do it. Scientists that work for government can't do it, and others. So, probably it is important that a grumpy old bloke is able to speak out on some of these things, to say it the way that I think it is.
Right. So you could say that that's the sort of meaning for your philosophy of life that underpins who you are, your identity, and what it is that you do, and provides that fundamental driving motivation to get you out of bed every day.
Absolutely. I think I love Australia. I love many parts in the world. I love the natural environments in those places, and I've seen in many cases that when you conserve the natural environment, it creates opportunities for employment, for engagement, First Nations peoples, all sorts of things. And it's in the past, in the Tony Abbott era, it was cast as a jobs versus the environment. Still that kind of crap from people like Barnaby Joyce and others. Yeah. But the reality is that it's about jobs and the environment if you do this the right way. And so prosecuting that case is fundamental to taking us to a better place. Because really, in the end, it's humanity that depends on us getting this right.
It's very well put, I think. Just out of curiosity, are you someone who, if you're not working, you're not happy? In some sense, like you have to be working to feel like things are going well, or you're doing the right thing. It's like not be working is to feel a little bit guilty and like, oh, no, I need to go do this thing now. Like, or I can't enjoy myself until I've done my work for the day, or however it is, to that end, to meet those ends, those goals.
Look, I get an enormous amount of mental stimulus from lots of things that I do. Like when I'm cross-country skiing, or when I'm walking, or when I'm out in the field, and that derives enormous pleasure. It actually triggers other ideas. So it is hard for my brain to switch off, but that's just the way it is. And it doesn't mean that that's a problem. I get excitement about making discoveries. I get excitement from seeing new things in the forest or in the woodlands, or thinking about new ideas. So, if that's the way it still is in 20 or 30 years' time, that's fine.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. I was in university not so long ago, and I think there really is a bit of a dilemma with young people at the moment, in that it's not many people have the kind of drive that, say, you do now, or that you would have had back then when you transitioned from playing soccer to going back to university, or to university, and to pursue that career. To have that sort of interest, that value, and that goal there before pursuing it in a formal sense. It's very useful and it's very powerful, and it's something that not a lot of students have at all. And so I think a lot of young people struggle to find drive, to develop a meaningful philosophy of how they think of life, their life, and their place in it, and thus what to pursue. And so on those notes, is there any advice that you would have for young people, that you could give to young people, to students, to academics, to whatever they are, in terms of trying to find and develop that guide, or to locate a place in life, to develop a meaningful philosophy, to look at the world around them like you did?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to break away from their electronic fix and go out and spend time in the environment and learn to enjoy it, and reconnect with what it means to be human, and go with your passions. That's really important. I sense that a lot of young people feel a sense of hopelessness. But I think it's critical that young people can engage and make a difference. They really are the future, and to run with these things, to be able to make a contribution. We need new cohorts of young people to make a difference in that space. It can't just be grumpy old blokes like me. And so one of my roles is really to encourage the next cohorts of young people to step into this space and make a difference that way, and recognise the world for what it is. It is a beautiful place, and it's worth conserving, and it's worth fighting for that conservation to make a difference. So, yeah, that's the space that I think is important and to work in.
Do you think that there is a good cohort of leaders and peers like yourself and peers to try and guide, from what you've seen being at a university and just more broadly, that young people currently have a good cohort of leaders to try and bring them into the next stage of their life and to them to then lead into the future? I
hope so. I hope that there are others. You know, when I think about some of the exciting things in the world, the new music, you know, the new ways of thinking. That's not my generation. That's not old blonde blokes like me. That's young people. It's young people of your vintage and others. You know, they're the ones that come up with interesting and exciting ideas about music, about writing, about poetry, about all kinds of things.
Ways of the world.
Yeah, and that's the future. That's not. I'm not the future. It's the 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, the 30-year-olds. It's the future, and that's what we have to nurture, and we have to encourage them to stay involved in science and in conservation and be motivated to make a difference, but to enjoy the environment as you're going along. That's what's critical. I'm going to have to go.
I see it's 8:00 now, so I'll leave you. Thank you for those final lovely words, David. It's been a fascinating conversation for me on my end. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure other people will too. So thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Okay.
Cheers. Bye. All right. See ya. Thanks, David.